In the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, where nothing ever happens and nobody ever comes, a down-on-his-luck cowboy named Jake Thornton made a discovery that would change not only his life, but the fate of humanity itself. What started as another lonely night checking his dying cattle turned into the most extraordinary encounter in human history. When a mysterious craft tore through the midnight sky and crashed into Crimson Valley, Jake had no idea that pulling a strange, reptilian being from the wreckage would trigger an interstellar crisis of unimaginable proportions. By sunrise, the quiet valley would be transformed into the epicenter of first contact with 200 alien warships hovering overhead, their intentions unknown, their power undeniable. This is the story of how one man's compassion toward a dying stranger became humanity's greatest hope, or its final mistake. Jake Thornton had known poverty his entire life, but the last 3 years had been particularly cruel. His small ranch in Crimson Valley, Arizona, inherited from his grandfather, was barely surviving. The drought had dried up his water sources, his cattle were thin and sickly, and the bank was threatening foreclosure within the month. At 42 years old, Jake found himself alone. His wife had left him 2 years ago, unable to bear the isolation and hardship any longer. His weathered face, permanently tanned from years under the merciless desert sun, told the story of a man who had fought hard but was losing the battle. Every morning, he woke up in his small, run-down ranch house, surrounded by peeling paint and memories of better times, wondering if today would be the day he finally gave up. That particular Tuesday night started like any other. Jake was making his rounds, checking on his remaining dozen cattle, when he noticed something odd in the sky. At first, he thought it was a shooting star, but the object was moving too slowly, too deliberately. It glowed with an eerie greenish-blue light that seemed to pulse as it descended. Within seconds, the object began to lose altitude rapidly, its trajectory taking it directly toward the valley. Jake's heart raced as he realized this wasn't any aircraft he'd ever seen. The thing was massive, easily the size of his barn, and it was completely silent, except for a low humming that he could feel in his chest more than hear with his ears. The craft hit the ground about a mile from his property, sending up a plume of dust and debris that Jake could see even in the darkness. The impact shook the ground beneath his feet, causing his horse to rear up in panic. For a moment, Jake considered staying where he was, calling the authorities, letting someone else deal with whatever this was. But something pulled him forward, maybe curiosity, maybe the cowboy code that said you don't leave anyone stranded in the desert, or maybe just the desperate hope that something, anything, might change his miserable circumstances. He saddled his horse and rode toward the crash site, his old rifle slung across his back more out of habit than any real belief it would be useful. As he approached, the scale of the wreckage became apparent. The craft had carved a trench through the desert floor nearly 50 yards long. It was unlike anything he'd seen in pictures or movies, organic looking, with a surface that seemed to shimmer and shift in the moonlight, covered in symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. Parts of it were crumpled from the impact, and others seemed to be melting or dissolving, releasing wisps of vapor that glowed faintly in the darkness. Jake dismounted cautiously, his boots crunching on the scattered debris. The air around the crash site felt different charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. His skin tingled, and he could taste something metallic. Part of him screamed to turn back, to run, but he pressed forward. That's when he heard it, a sound that was unmistakably a cry of pain. It was alien, yes, higher pitched than a human voice, with harmonics that seemed impossible, but pain was pain in any language. He found her, he would later think of the being as her, though he had no real basis for the assumption pinned beneath a section of the craft's hull. In the dim light from the wreckage, Jake's first clear view of an alien being was almost too much for his mind to process. She was roughly humanoid in shape, perhaps 6 feet tall, but her skin was covered in fine scales that reflected the light like polished gemstones. shifting between deep emerald green and midnight blue. Her face was elongated, with large golden eyes that had vertical pupils like a cat's or a snake's. She had no nose, as he understood it, just two small slits, and her mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Her hands, reaching weakly toward him, had four long fingers ending in retractable claws. For a long moment, Jake and the alien simply stared at each other. He should have been terrified. Every instinct should have told him to run. But what he saw in those strange golden eyes wasn't the gaze of a monster. It was the look of someone in terrible pain, someone who knew they were dying, someone pleading for help. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of wounded animals, in the eyes of his father at the end. It was a look that transcended species. "All right," Jake said softly, though he knew she probably couldn't understand him. "All right, I'm gonna help you. Just ... Just hold on." He assessed the situation quickly. The piece of hull pinning her looked impossibly heavy, but the crash had weakened its structure. Using a fallen beam as a lever and summoning strength he didn't know he still had, Jake managed to shift the debris enough for the alien to pull herself free. She cried out in pain as she moved, and Jake saw that one of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Her left arm also hung limply, and a strange luminescent blue fluid, her blood, he realized was seeping from various wounds. She tried to stand but immediately collapsed. Jake caught her, surprised by how light she felt despite her height. Her bones must be hollow or at least far less dense than human bones. Her scales felt smooth and cool against his skin, and he could feel a rapid, fluttering heartbeat that seemed too fast. Up close, he could see that she was wearing some kind of form-fitting suit, also damaged in the crash, that covered most of her body. Technology was embedded in its small lights and screens that flickered weakly. "Come on," Jake said, gently lifting her as best he could. "My ranch isn't far. I've got medical supplies, water. We'll figure something out." The alien's golden eyes focused on him with an intensity that was almost unnerving. She made several sounds, actually, in rapid succession. It was clearly language, complex and nuanced, but completely incomprehensible to him. Then, to his amazement, she raised one trembling hand and touched his forehead with two fingers. There was a flash of warmth, a moment of disorientation, and suddenly he could understand her. "You ... help. Death ... gratitude ... double quotes." The words came in fragments, incomplete, but the meaning was clear enough. She was thanking him. She hadn't expected help. She had expected to die alone in the wreckage. The connection faded, and she went limp in his arms, unconscious. Jake secured her as gently as possible on his horse and began the slow journey back to his ranch, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Behind him, the crash ship continued to dissolve, as if it were programmed to destroy itself rather than leave evidence. By the time he looked back from a distance, only a faint glow marked where it had been. Getting the alien into his house proved to be one of the most surreal experiences of Jake's life. He cleared his dining table, not that he ever used it for dining anymore, and carefully laid her on it. In the harsh fluorescent light of his kitchen, she looked even more otherworldly. Her scales caught the light in mesmerizing patterns, and he could see now that what he'd thought was just coloring was actually incredibly intricate, each scale bearing its own unique marking. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. That strange blue blood had stained his shirt and was dripping onto his floor. Jake had treated plenty of injured animals over the years, and even set his own broken bones on occasion. But this was entirely different. He didn't know her anatomy, didn't know what might help or hurt her, didn't even know if human medicines would be toxic to her system. He did what he could, cleaned her wounds with water and antiseptic, trying not to wince at the smell of burning that rose when the antiseptic touched her skin. He splinted her broken leg using techniques he'd learned from ranch work, hoping that at least the principle of immobilizing a fracture was universal. He covered her with blankets when he noticed she seemed to be shivering, though he wasn't sure if she was actually cold or if this was some other kind of physiological response. As he worked, Jake's mind raced with questions and implications. There were aliens, real, actual aliens, and one was currently unconscious on his dining table. He should call someone, the police, the military, the FBI, someone. This was bigger than him, bigger than his little ranch, bigger than anything that had ever happened in Crimson Valley. But something stopped him every time he reached for the phone. Maybe it was the memory of those golden eyes pleading for help. Maybe it was the touch to his forehead, the trust implicit in that gesture. Or maybe, if he was honest with himself, it was simpler than that. If he called the authorities, they would take her away. They would turn her into a specimen, a subject for study. They might even dissect her. And Jake, who had been helpless to prevent so many losses in his life, couldn't bear to be responsible for one more. He dozed in his chair beside her, jolting awake every time she moved or made a sound. Around 3 in the morning, her golden eyes suddenly opened, focusing on him with startling clarity. She tried to sit up, then gasped in pain and fell back. Jake stood quickly, hands raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he said softly. "You're hurt pretty bad. Just rest." The alien's eyes darted around the room, taking in her surroundings with obvious alarm. She made sounds in her language, rapid and sharp. Then, with visible effort, she raised her hand again toward his forehead. This time, when she touched him, the connection was stronger, clearer. Where ... ship. People mind ... danger. Must warn ... double quotes. The words came through more coherently now, though still fragmentary. Jake understood she was asking about her ship and warning him about something. "Your ship is destroyed," Jake said slowly, not sure if the connection worked both ways. "It dissolved after you were rescued. You're at my ranch, my home. You're safe here." He paused, then asked a question that had been burning in his mind. "What happened to you? Why did you crash?" The alien's expression, though her features were so different, somehow he could still read emotion in them, shifted to something like anguish. Through the connection, images and impressions flooded Jake's mind rather than words. He saw a vast ship, a massive craft making the crashed vessel look like a rowboat next to an aircraft carrier. He saw conflict, violence, some kind of disagreement or rebellion. He saw the alien, her name was something unpronounceable, but the impression translated roughly to swift current or perhaps running water fleeing, taking a small scout ship, being pursued. He saw her ship taking damage, systems failing, her desperate attempt to reach the surface of this planet before the ship exploded entirely. "You were running away," Jake said slowly, understanding dawning. "You were escaping from something." Swift Current's eyes closed briefly, confirming his interpretation. Then more images came, a fleet of ships, enormous and powerful, searching for her. A sense of urgency, of time running out. And then a feeling that made Jake's blood run cold. These ships were coming here, to Earth, following her trail. The connection broke, and Swift Current slumped back, exhausted from the effort. Jake stood frozen, his mind trying to process what he'd just learned. Aliens were real. One was lying injured in his kitchen, and more were coming. Possibly hostile, possibly in ships large enough to hold thousands. And they were looking for the being he'd just rescued. He'd thought his biggest problem was losing his ranch. Now, he might have just become responsible for humanity's first contact with an alien species, and it might not be a friendly one. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Jake kept watch while Swift Current drifted in and out of consciousness. He found himself studying her more closely now that the initial shock had worn off. Despite her reptilian appearance, there was an elegance to her form, a grace in the way she moved, even in her injured state. Her scales weren't just armor. They seemed to serve multiple purposes, shifting color slightly in response to her condition. When she was in pain, they darkened. When she seemed calmer, they returned to that striking emerald blue. He noticed that she had what might be ear-small openings on the sides of her head, covered by tiny scales that seemed more flexible than the others. As dawn approached, Jake made coffee strong, black, the way he always drank it, and tried to decide what to do. Every logical part of his brain said he should call the authorities. This was first contact. This was history. This was way above his pay grade. But another part of him, maybe the part that had saved injured coyotes and bottle-fed orphan calves, that had always helped the stranger, even when he had nothing to spare. That part said his responsibility was to the individual in front of him, not to some abstract concept of protocol or procedure. Swift Current woke again as the first light of dawn started creeping through the windows. This time, she seemed more alert, more aware. She looked at Jake with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been calculation. He still couldn't fully read her alien features. She reached out again, and he let her touch his forehead, the connection establishing more easily now, as if they were both learning how to use it. You gave ... kindness, unexpected ... My people ... not know humans are. Compassionate. The impressions came through, clearer than before. I am grateful, but must warn ... danger comes. My escape detected ... they follow. They will arrive ... soon. Jake felt his stomach drop. How soon? He asked, though he wasn't sure if his words were being transmitted back through the connection. Apparently, they were, because Swift Current's response came immediately, and it chilled him to the bone. Hours ... perhaps one rotation of your planet. They come in force ... 200 ships. Maybe more. Jake pulled back from the connection, his heart pounding. One day. They had one day before 200 alien ships arrived in Crimson Valley. What did they want? He asked aloud, then realized she'd broken the connection. He gestured helplessly, trying to communicate through hand signals. Why? Why are they coming? Swift Current seemed to understand his urgency. She struggled to sit up, and despite his protests, managed to prop herself against the wall. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture that might have been a crown or a symbol of authority. Then she drew a line across her throat, a gesture that apparently was universal enough. They were coming for her, and they intended to kill her. The morning sun rose over Crimson Valley, as it always did, indifferent to the drama unfolding in Jake's rundown ranch house. Jake made breakfast eggs and bacon, because it was what he had, and was surprised when Swift Current showed interest in the food. She couldn't eat the bacon, it seemed, but the eggs she carefully tasted, then consumed with something like enthusiasm. At least that was one less problem. She could survive on at least some Earth food. They sat in his kitchen, an impoverished cowboy and a fugitive alien, eating scrambled eggs while trying to figure out how to prevent an interstellar incident. Through repeated connections and growing mutual understanding, Jake learned Swift Current's story. She was a member of her species' ruling council, or had been until she discovered something that her people's leadership wanted to keep hidden. The details were complex, filtered through alien concepts that didn't translate well, but the essence was familiar enough: corruption, abuse of power, dissent being silenced. Swift Current had spoken out, had tried to reveal the truth, and had been marked for execution. She'd fled in the only ship she could access, a small scout vessel, hoping to reach some remote outpost where she might hide or find allies. She had never intended to come to Earth. Her ship had been damaged in the pursuit, its navigation systems failing. Earth's gravity well had caught her, and she'd crashed before she could regain control. Now, her people's military was coming, not for exploration, not for contact, but for her. They would retrieve her, execute her for treason, and leave. But their arrival would still represent humanity's first contact with alien life. And Swift Current warned that her people were not gentle in their dealings with species they considered primitive. Your world, ... not ready. My people see you as children playing with fire. might study ... might ignore ... might decide you are. Threat to be eliminated. The impressions came through clearly now. They'd been practicing the connection, and Jake was getting better at receiving the complex ideas she was trying to convey. If they come in force, if they bring battle fleet, they will not care about your cities ... your people. Collateral damage acceptable in their pursuit of traitor. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He was in way over his head. This wasn't just about saving one alien anymore. This was about protecting his entire species from beings with technology centuries or millennia beyond humanity's capability. And he had hours, maybe less, to figure out how to do that. "Can you contact them?" Jake asked. "Tell them you'll turn yourself in if they leave Earth alone?" Swift Current's expression, he was learning to read it now. The subtle shifts in scale color. The angle of her head showed something like bitter amusement. "They will not negotiate ... I am already dead in their eyes. They come to retrieve body and eliminate witnesses. They will not believe I survive. Or if I do, they will not care." Then the connection brought something else, a spark of hope, or maybe desperation. "Unless ... there is way. If could reach my ship's core, before dissolved completely. There is beacon ... could send message, not to my people ... to others ... Those who would oppose this action, but timing critical. And I cannot walk." Jake stood up quickly. "Show me where the ship was." "I'll go. I'll get whatever you need." But Swift Current grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so injured. "Ship core. Designed to destroy if tampered by others ... You would not survive ... Even if avoided destruction, radiation would kill you slowly. Painful death ... They stared at each other, the impossibility of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Then Jake made a decision. "Show me anyway," he said firmly. "I've been dying slowly for years. At least this way it might mean something." Over the next hour, Swift Current used the connection to teach Jake everything she could about her ship's systems. It was like trying to learn advanced physics, engineering, and a new language all at once. But the connection helped. Information didn't just come as words, it came as understanding, as if the knowledge was being directly downloaded into his brain. It gave him a headache like nothing he'd ever experienced, but he persisted. The plan was desperate and probably suicidal, but it was all they had. Jake would return to the crash site, locate what remained of the ship's core, and extract a small device. Swift Current called it a quantum beacon that could send a message faster than light to her allies. If he succeeded, and if her allies were able to respond, they might arrive before the military fleet. They might be able to intercede, to prevent violence, to negotiate. It was a long shot built on a foundation of hope and desperation, but it was better than nothing. As Jake prepared to leave, checking his gear and trying not to think too hard about what he was about to do, Swift Current stopped him one more time. The connection she established was different, this time deeper, more intimate. He felt her gratitude, her genuine affection for this strange human who had shown her kindness when he had every reason to be terrified or hostile. He felt her regret that she had brought this danger to his world. And he felt something else, a sort of blessing or gift. She was doing something to him, changing something at a cellular level, using technology he couldn't begin to understand that was built into her very body. Protection, the impression came through, cannot prevent all damage, but will help you survive, help you recover. If fate is kind... She pulled back, and Jake felt different, not radically, but subtly. His chronic back pain from years of hard labor was gone. He felt stronger, more alert. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing the words were inadequate. Then he headed out into the morning sun, toward a crashed alien ship and a slim chance at saving the world. The desert stretched before Jake like an alien landscape of its own, the morning heat already shimmering off the sand and rocks. He rode hard, pushing his horse as fast as he dared across the rough terrain. The crash site wasn't far as the crow flies, but navigating the arroyos and rocky outcrops made it a 20-minute ride. Every minute felt precious now, every second ticking away toward the moment when 200 warships would appear in Earth's sky. As he approached the site, Jake's breath caught in his throat. He'd expected to find wreckage, debris, maybe some scorched ground. Instead, what remained of Swift Current's ship was far more unsettling. The craft hadn't just dissolved, it had transformed. What was left looked more organic than mechanical, like the skeleton of some massive alien creature, with surfaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with faint internal light. The air around it was thick with that metallic taste he'd noticed before, and his skin immediately began to tingle uncomfortably. Jake dismounted and approached cautiously, following the mental map Swift Current had planted in his mind. The ship's core should be toward the rear of the craft, buried under what had been the propulsion system. He'd need to dig, to move debris, and to do it all while being exposed to whatever radiation or energy the dying ship was still emitting. As he worked, Jake couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of his situation. 2 days ago, his biggest worry was whether the bank would give him another extension on his mortgage. Now he was excavating an alien spacecraft, trying to recover technology that shouldn't exist, to send a message to beings he'd never heard of, to prevent a war between species. If he survived this, no one would ever believe him. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. The debris wasn't just heavy, it was hot, almost burning to the touch even through his work gloves. Some pieces seemed to actively resist being moved, as if the ship's automated systems were still trying to complete their self-destruction protocol. Jake's muscles strained, his back ached despite whatever Swift Current had done to him, and sweat poured down his face in the relentless desert heat. But he kept digging, kept pulling away pieces of the wreck, driven by the mental image Swift Current had given him of what would happen if those warships arrived unchallenged. After 30 minutes of exhausting labor, Jake finally found it, the core. It was about the size of a basketball, perfectly spherical, and it glowed with that same eerie blue-green light. It was nestled in a cavity that was lined with what looked like crystalline structures, all pulsing in rhythm with the core's glow. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, it represented technology so far beyond human capability that Jake felt a moment of vertigo looking at it. Carefully, following Swift Current's instructions, he reached into the cavity. The heat was intense, and even through his gloves, he could feel it burning his hands. The quantum beacon should be attached to the core, a smaller device maybe the size of his fist. He felt around carefully, trying not to disturb anything that might trigger a catastrophic reaction. There, his fingers closed around something that felt different from the core itself, smoother, cooler. He pulled gently, and with a soft click, the device came free. It was beautiful, covered in that same kind of shimmer as Swift Current's scales, covered in symbols that seemed to move and shift as he looked at them. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Jake carefully placed the beacon in his saddlebag and was about to leave when he heard it, a sound like thunder, but coming from above, not from the sky. He looked up and his heart nearly stopped. The sky was changing. Where there had been clear blue morning sky, there were now distortions, like heat ripples, but vertical, expanding. And through these ripples, shapes were beginning to emerge. Ships. Massive, impossible ships, each one easily the size of an aircraft carrier, their surfaces reflecting the sunlight in ways that hurt to look at. They were arriving early. Swift Current's people had found her faster than expected. Jake mounted his horse and kicked it into a gallop, racing back toward the ranch. Behind him, more ships continued to materialize in the sky, descending slowly toward the valley. The quantum beacon in his saddlebag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, like the hopes of his entire species were compressed into that one small device. As he rode, He could see people emerging from their homes in the distance, pointing at the sky, some running, some standing frozen in disbelief. The world was about to change forever. A poor cowboy from Crimson Valley was carrying the only thing that might give humanity a chance. He reached the ranch in record time, nearly falling off his horse in his haste to get inside. Swift Current was sitting up, her broken leg still splinted, but her eyes alert and focused. She must have sensed what was happening, because she already had her hand extended, ready to establish the connection. They came early. I feared this ... Did you retrieve beacon? Jake pulled the device from his bag and held it up. Swift Current's expression, he could definitely read her emotions now, showed relief mixed with urgency. Div ... to me ... must activate ... must send message. But Jake ... pull quotes. The connection brought a wave of emotion. He wasn't expecting fear. Not for herself, but for him. When I activate ... signal will draw them here. Directly here. We will have minutes before they arrive. You should run ... should leave. You have done enough ... double quotes. Jake looked at the alien he'd rescued less than 12 hours ago. This being from another world, who had somehow become the most important person in his life. He thought about his empty ranch, his dying cattle, his failed marriage, all the years of struggling and barely surviving. And then he thought about the ships outside, the people of Crimson Valley looking up in terror, the whole world about to discover they weren't alone in the universe. No, he said firmly. I'm not running. We finish this together. Swift Current's scales shimmered through a whole spectrum of colors: surprise, gratitude, affection, determination. She took the beacon from his hands, and Jake watched as she manipulated it in ways his human fingers never could have managed. Her claws interfacing with controls that seemed to respond to her touch specifically. The device began to glow brighter, pulsing with increasing intensity. Then, with a sound like a crystal bell being struck, it activated. Jake felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to pass through his entire body, through the walls of his house, through the ground itself. The message was being sent, shooting out into space faster than light, reaching for all eyes who might or might not respond, who might or might not arrive in time. Outside, the sound of the ships grew louder. Jake moved to the window and looked out, his breath catching in his throat. They were closer now, much closer. He could make out details on their hulls, weapons ports, viewing portals, markings in that same alien script he'd seen on Swift Current's suit. And they were all converging on one location, his ranch. They were coming for Swift Current, and they were coming now. The next few minutes felt like they lasted hours. Jake and Swift Current sat in the kitchen of his small ranch house, waiting, the activated quantum beacon pulsing between them like a technological heartbeat. Through the window, Jake could see the alien ships taking up positions around the valley, forming a perimeter that encompassed his property at its center. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, their surfaces seeming to flow like liquid metal, their shapes defying normal aerodynamics because they clearly didn't need to worry about something as primitive as air resistance. The lead ship, larger than the others, descended until it hovered directly over Jake's property, no more than 100 feet above the ground. The wash from whatever technology was keeping it aloft kicked up dust and debris, rattling his windows and making his house creak alarmingly. Then, a beam of light shot down from the ship, forming a pillar that connected the vessel to the ground just outside Jake's front door. And down that beam, figures began to descend. They were Swift Current species. Jake could see that immediately, but different. These wore armor that seemed to be alive, constantly shifting and adapting, covered in weapons and technology that made them look like walking arsenals. There were 6 of them, and they moved with predatory grace, forming a perimeter around Jake's house. One of them, slightly larger than the others, stepped forward and did something to a device on its arm. When it spoke, The words came out in English, heavily accented and artificial sounding, clearly being translated by technology, but understandable. Human, you harbor a criminal of the Sign Collective. Surrender swift current through darkness to our custody, and you will not be harmed. Resist, and you will be eliminated along with your dwelling. You have 30 of your seconds to comply. Jake looked at Swift Current, who met his gaze steadily. Through their connection, without needing to touch, now, the repeated contact had established something permanent between them. He felt her resolve. She would not surrender. She would rather die here, in this small human dwelling, than be taken back to face execution as a traitor. And she was giving him permission to hand her over, to save himself, showing him that she would understand if he did. Jake turned back to the window and did possibly the stupidest thing he'd done in a life that had recently included several very stupid decisions. He opened the door, stepped out onto his porch, and faced the armored aliens with nothing but his stubborn cowboy pride and a righteousness born of a lifetime of being pushed around. "No," he said simply. "She's hurt. She crashed here by accident. She's done nothing to your people or mine. I'm not handing her over to be executed." The lead alien's head tilted, and Jake could have sworn he heard amusement in the translated voice. "Human, you do not understand the situation. We have 200 warships in orbit above your planet. We could eliminate your entire species before your governments could mount a response. You are attempting to protect a criminal with nothing but primitive weapons and courage. It is admirable in a foolish way, but ultimately pointless." The alien raised one arm, and Jake saw weapon systems activating, glowing with power. "Last chance, human. 10 seconds. 9. 8. Double quotes. Jake closed his eyes, wondering if this was really how it would end, vaporized on his own porch for trying to do the right thing. But then he felt it a change in the air, a new vibration, different from the ships already here. He opened his eyes and looked up, and hope surged through him like electricity. The sky was opening again, but this time the ships that emerged were different. They were sleeker, more elegant, their surfaces adorned with markings that seemed to emit their own light. And there were more of them, not 200, but at least 300, perhaps more, their numbers still growing as they poured through some kind of portal or gateway that was tearing space itself. The alien soldiers around Jake's house immediately raised their weapons, pointing them upward, their posture shifting from confident to defensive in an instant. The large alien spoke rapidly into its communication device in its own language, the translator not bothering to convert it. But Jake didn't need a translation to understand the tone: surprise, alarm, and maybe fear. One of the new ships descended rapidly, positioning itself between the warship hovering over Jake's property and the house itself. A voice boomed out, speaking in the same alien language, and this time, Jake's connection to Swift Current allowed him to understand it not perfectly, but enough. "By the authority of the assembled councils and the Treaty of Ascension, you are ordered to stand down. Swift Current through darkness is under the protection of the reformist fleet. Any action against her or the indigenous species of this world will be considered an act of war." The lead soldier near Jake's house seemed frozen, caught between orders and this new development. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension was so thick, Jake felt like he could reach out and touch it. Then, reluctantly, the soldiers began to lower their weapons. The beam of light from the warship above retracted, pulling them back up. The ship began to rise, pulling back from its threatening position. All around the valley, the military fleet was withdrawing, moving back to higher orbit, their aggression checked by the arrival of this new force. Jake's legs felt weak, and he had to grab the porch railing to keep from collapsing. They'd done it. The message had gotten through. Swift Current's allies had arrived, and they'd arrived in force. Behind him, he heard a sound and turned to see Swift Current standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame, her broken leg making standing agony, but her expression one of fierce triumph. A new beam of light descended, this one gentler, landing right in Jake's front yard. Down it came a single figure, unarmored, wearing robes that seemed to be made of light itself. The being approached the porch slowly, respectfully, and when it spoke, its voice was warm and dignified. Swift current through darkness. The Reformist Council has received your evidence. Your actions have been vindicated. You are no criminal, but a hero to those who value truth over comfort. The robed alien turned to Jake, and he felt something like the connection he had with Swift Current, but gentler, more formal. And you human ... you have done something remarkable. You showed compassion to a stranger, at great personal risk. You protected someone who had no claim on your protection, simply because it was right. Your world is young, your people new to the greater cosmos, but this action speaks well of your species' potential. Jake didn't know what to say, so he said the only thing that felt true. I just did what anyone should do. You see someone hurt, someone scared, you help them. That's all. The robed alien made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been approval. If only that were true throughout the cosmos, human. If only the being turned back to Swift Current. You require healing that cannot be properly accomplished here. Will you return with us? Swift Current looked at Jake, and through their connection, he felt the conflict in her. She needed to go. She had work to do, testimony to give, a corrupt leadership to help overthrow. But she didn't want to leave him. This human who had saved her life, who had risked everything for a stranger from the stars. "Oh," Jake said softly, "you've got important things to do. The whole galaxy needs you more than one broke cowboy does." Swift Current moved forward, ignoring the pain in her broken leg, and placed both her hands on either side of Jake's face. The connection that flooded through him was overwhelming gratitude deeper than any words could express. Affection that transcended species and a promise. She would return. When her work was done, when the corruption in her government was exposed and justice was served, she would come back to this small ranch in Crimson Valley, to the human who had shown her that compassion existed even in the most unlikely places. Then she was gone, lifted up in the beam of light, taken aboard the Reformist ship for healing, and from the battles ahead, political battles. Not military ones, but battles nonetheless. Jake stood on his porch and watched as the ships began to depart, both fleets leaving Earth's orbit. The military vessels went first, recalled by a leadership that was about to face serious questions about their actions. The Reformist fleet lingered longer, and Jake had the sense they were scanning, studying, taking measure of this world that had suddenly become significant in ways humanity didn't yet understand. The robed alien had remained behind, standing in Jake's yard, watching the ships depart with him. Your world will be contacted officially, through proper channels, within your planetary rotation period, the being said. This incident has accelerated certain discussions about Earth's readiness for contact. What happens next will be decided by your people and mine, through dialogue and negotiation. But know this, Jake Thornton, you have friends among the stars now. And that is no small thing. Before Jake could respond, the alien did something unexpected. It reached into its robes and pulled out a small device, smooth and crystalline, about the size of a cell phone but infinitely more advanced. A gift for communication. Swift Current will be able to reach you through this, and we of the Reformist Council as well. You stand at the threshold of a new era, human. Your world will meet guides, advisors, friends who understand both your people and ours. If you are willing, you could serve as a bridge between species. Jake took the device carefully, feeling its warmth in his hand, seeing symbols flowing across its surface. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," he said honestly. "I'm nobody important. Just a guy trying to hold onto a failing ranch." The alien's expression was unreadable, its features too different from human or even from Swift Current's people, but something in its posture conveyed understanding. Sometimes the most important people are those who never sought importance. Consider it, Jake Thornton, but for now, rest. You have earned it. The being ascended in its own beam of light, and moments later, the last of the reformist ships vanished, leaving Earth's sky clear and blue and normal, as if the last few hours had been nothing but a fever dream. The aftermath of first contact was chaos, predictably. Jake's ranch became ground zero for what every news agency in the world was calling the Crimson Valley Incident. Military helicopters, news vans, government officials in black SUVs, they all descended on his property within hours. The other residents of Crimson Valley confirmed what they'd seen. The ships, hundreds of them, hovering over the valley. Satellite imagery backed up their stories. Cell phone videos, grainy and shaky, showed the vessels in the sky. This wasn't a hoax or mass hallucination. First contact had happened, and a poor cowboy had been at the center of it. Jake told his story to so many different people that it began to feel unreal even to him. FBI, agents, military intelligence, scientists from NASA, and a dozen other agencies, they all wanted to hear about Swift Current, about the crash, about the standoff on his porch. Some believed him easily. The evidence was too overwhelming to deny. Others were skeptical of details, questioning whether he'd really communicated with the alien, whether the events had unfolded exactly as he described. But the communication device the Reformist Council had given him was real. Solid, undeniable proof that something extraordinary had occurred. The world changed overnight. The United Nations called an emergency session. Every government on Earth had to grapple with the sudden, undeniable knowledge that humanity was not alone, that there were civilizations out there among the stars, advanced civilizations with faster-than-light travel with weapons that could destroy planets with political systems and conflicts of their own. Some people panicked, others celebrated. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile their doctrines with alien life. Scientists were ecstatic, already drafting proposals for how humanity might learn from these new friends among the stars. For Jake personally, life became complicated in ways he'd never imagined. He was offered money, lots of it, for interviews, book deals, movie rights. News networks wanted him as a consultant, as a recurring guest. Universities wanted to study him. Psychologists wanted to understand his decision-making process. He turned down most of it, accepting just enough to pay off his ranch and buy some new cattle. The attention was overwhelming, the fame unwanted. He'd saved an alien because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted to become a celebrity. 3 weeks after the incident, as the initial frenzy was finally beginning to die down and Jake was starting to hope he might return to something approaching normal life, the communication device activated for the first time. It glowed with that familiar blue-green light, and suddenly he could see Swift Current's face, or rather, a holographic projection of her face, floating above the device. She looked healthier than when he'd last seen her, her scales bright and vibrant, her injuries healed. Jake, her voice came through clearly now, the device translating perfectly. I wanted to let you know that the evidence I carried has been presented to the assembled councils. The corruption within my government's leadership has been exposed. Those responsible are facing justice. None of this would have been possible without you. Jake felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the device. I'm glad you're okay, he said simply. I'm glad you were able to do what you needed to do. Swift Current's expression, he could read it so clearly now, showed something like fondness. The Reformist Council has been working with your United Nations to establish proper contact protocols. There will be exchanges of information, of culture, of technology, carefully managed, of course. Your world isn't ready for everything all at once. But it's a beginning. She paused, and Jake could sense there was something more she wanted to say. Jake, I have been asked to serve as one of the primary liaisons between my people and yours. I would be stationed on Earth, working to build understanding between our species. The position would be based ... double quotes, another pause. in Crimson Valley, near your ranch. If you would be comfortable with that arrangement. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. The alien who had crashed into his life 3 weeks ago, who had fundamentally changed everything about his existence, was asking permission to stay close, to remain part of his life. He thought about his small ranch, his quiet existence that had suddenly become so much larger. He thought about the loneliness that had defined his life for so long. And he thought about those golden eyes that had pleaded for help in the wreckage of a crashed ship, and how helping her had given his life more meaning than anything else he'd ever done. "I'd like that," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd like that a lot." Swift current scales shimmered through a spectrum of colors that Jake now understood meant happiness. "Then I will see you soon, my friend. I will see you soon." The communication ended, and Jake stood on his porch in the fading evening light, looking up at the stars. They seemed closer now, more real. No longer just distant points of light, but actual places where actual beings lived and loved and struggled with their own problems. Somewhere up there, Swift Current was preparing to return to Earth, to return to him. Somewhere up there, humanity had allies now, friends, and perhaps eventually something more. His life would never be simple again. The ranch would likely become a hub for human-alien relations, visited by diplomats and scientists, and who knew what else. He would have responsibilities now, serving as a bridge between species, helping both sides understand each other. It was overwhelming, terrifying, exciting. But as Jake went back inside his house, the same house where just weeks ago he'd been contemplating giving up, letting the bank take the ranch, accepting defeat, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future. He de-saved an alien's life on a random Tuesday night because it was the right thing to do, never expecting anything in return. And in doing so, he'd saved himself, given his life purpose and meaning, and helped usher in a new era for his entire species. The poor cowboy from Crimson Valley poured himself a glass of whiskey and raised it toward the stars in a silent toast. To Swift Current, to the Reformist Council, to all the beings out there among the stars who valued truth and compassion over power and fear, and to himself for having the courage to help a stranger even when every logical reason said not to. The stars seemed to twinkle in response, and Jake smiled. Tomorrow, government officials would be back with more questions. News vans would probably return when word got out about Swift Current's upcoming return. His life would continue to be complicated and strange and nothing like he'd planned. But tonight, he was just a man who had done the right thing and discovered that sometimes the universe rewards compassion in ways you could never imagine. Outside, a shooting star streaked across the sky, or maybe it wasn't a shooting star at all, but a ship arriving or departing, carrying beings from worlds he'd never seen to destinations he couldn't imagine. Jake watched it until it disappeared beyond the horizon, then went inside to rest. He had a feeling he would need his strength in the days ahead. After all, he was now officially humanity's friend to the stars, the man who had rescued an alien princess, though Swift Current would have laughed at that description and changed the course of history. Not bad for a broke cowboy from Crimson Valley. Not bad at all. The communication device pulsed gently on his kitchen table, a reminder that he was connected now to something vast and wonderful and terrifying. Connected to Swift Current, to the Reformist Council, to an entire galaxy of life and possibility. And as Jake finally allowed himself to sleep for the first time in years, he dreamed not of loss and failure, but of the future among the stars, built on the foundation of one simple act of compassion on a desert night when a poor cowboy decided to help a stranger who had fallen from the sky.